Alright, so what we're going to start with, and there's a few people I know forgot their objects, but how many people have managed to get themselves a pair of calipers as well? Very good. Almost 2/3 of the class. Excellent. So I'm going to teach you how to use these too. And the object I'm going to show you is this little plastic Lego Duplo style brick. Alright, how to model this. You can follow along, but really this is just one that you can watch on screen. So with your calipers, there's typically 3 ways to measure using these. Alright. The first way is with the main teeth at the bottom, where you have this on 0, 0 to begin with. When you open out, you're able to then measure the exterior faces of an object, typically flat faces, or if something's round, you can measure the diameter of something. Alright, so in this case, this square Lego brick is about 63 by 63. So I'm going to start that off. Select chain. Put my dimensions in. So when you're measuring your objects, it's a little bit different for surfacing. I'll touch on that later, but for anything that you can measure, I'd like the measurements within 0.1 of a millimetre. Okay. So that's 63 by 63. And then obviously I can measure the height as well. So I can use that from top to bottom to measure the height, 18.3. And 18.3, extrude straight up. Now this part's hollow on the bottom, but that's one of the details I'm going to do towards the end. Alright, so if you've got a plastic component, and we'll talk about this when we go through the surfacing demo, you start with just the exterior form, we remove the material later on. Alright, so the next parts to measure are the dots on the top, okay, or the 4 main circles. So again, with the calipers, the area down the bottom there, I can open in, open out, close that around the diameter, so it's 26.5. Alright, now, think about this object and where we've got, or trying to think about the way to model this, and this is what you guys will start to think about today with your own objects. We're trying to do it as efficiently as possible. So this is an object that's symmetrical, both vertically and horizontally. Okay, so you could say that you could just model one corner of this, one quadrant, and pattern it 4 times, or you could model one quadrant and mirror it across the side and then across the bottom. There's pros and cons of doing it different each way. In this case, what I'm going to do is do it with some sketches, okay, for these main circles, and then for the ones on top, I might do that as a pattern later. Right? So, that top edge, yeah. Well, that's actually a chamfer. Okay, it's a straight edge, and then there's a very small fillet on each edge of the chamfer. We'll do that later on. So with this 26.5 here for that diameter, what I'm going to do is in the sketch, I'm going to work out how these are separated. So I'm going to mirror that circle across to the side, and then mirror both of these down to the bottom. This is where that second part of the calipers comes in with measuring. So where we've got these 2 teeth at the top, and they're measuring the outside, when you open those out, you can actually put that into gaps. So I can put that into the gap between the 2 diameters and open that out, and once that's reached its maximum, I know the gap between those is now 5 millimeters. Okay. So when I want to do that measurement between those 2, I hold Shift, and I can get the edges and go 5. Now I have to do that same on the side here. And now those are fully defined. So that those top teeth on your calipers, they're really good for measuring any sort of hole as well. So if we had a part here, as you can see, and we've got this hole in this section here, instead of trying to guess with the outside, you use the inside, fit it in, maximize that out. Like it says 22.5 by 10.3. All right, so that's the way you can use that part of the calipers. The last part is where you can use this bottom section. All right, so when this is closed, that's at 0, 0, and as you extend that down, it's also measuring the depth. So with that, I can actually measure from this top surface down to the surface below. So I can set that on the top, push that down, make sure it stays horizontal, but when it gets to the bottom there, I can see it's 19.3. So when I extrude this up, that's what gives me that measurement there. So that's good for any sort of cavity, any sort of hole that is a deep hole. Okay, you can stick that in, push that down to get the depth from that end to there. Alternatively, with that sort of detail, okay, I could also just measure, I've already got that bottom half there, I can then just measure the total height, all right, subtract that from what I've already got there to work out the height of that middle section. Okay, so now I've got the basic shape, I'm going to add those other details. So first up is the chamfer on the edge. Now, as much as you can, you'll want to use your measuring device, either calipers or ruler, to measure those sort of details. This is a bit trickier because obviously a fillet or a chamfer is taking material off the edge. So sometimes what you might need to do is actually use your eye to get the rough size in, and then one thing I can measure would be this diameter at the top of this Lego brick. So with my calipers I can measure and see that that is about 16.5. Now to measure something in my model, which I haven't actually added a measurement on or a dimension on, click on evaluate measure. Okay, and then you can select that edge and it will give you the diameter. Okay, or if I select two circles, it will give me like a distance between them, center to center, or I can measure face to face. Okay, and you can get a lot of different measurements using this measure tool. So that had that at 20.5, and I need it to be 16.5. So if I adjust this chamfer by 2, maybe that's too much. 16.5, no, that's right. Okay, so that's correct now. That chamfer, I can edit that and just put that on all 4. Press OK. Right, so this also has a very small radius on each of these edges. So that radius might be only 0.5 millimeter. These sort of details, I don't expect you to measure. But what you'll start to do is have a look at the object in your hand and judge that radius just compared to what you can see on screen. So it actually looks a bit bigger. If you think about that chamfer being 5 and now this radius being 0.5 millimeter, 1/10, in my hand the radius actually looks like a bigger proportion than that. So I might bump that up to 1 or 0.8 or something like that, and that's fine. When you're doing your model, these dimensions, they're not going to be, I'm not going to check whether it's 0.8 or 1, it's more about how it looks. Okay, so I'll put that at 1, press OK. All right, so there's a little dimple detail on the top of these bricks, but I'm going to show you I'm going to show a couple other tricks, or show that last actually after I've done a shell. So if you've got any sort of plastic objects, okay, and you get to the stage where you want to remove the material on the inside, what we use is the shell tool. Right, so You can see that on the features bar, command manager. Removes material from a solid body to create a thin-walled feature. So how the shell tool works, I'm just going to create a separate body over here to explain. So when you have two solid bodies, like we worked on last week, and you press shell, it's going to ask you which body you want to shell. You can only shell one body at a time. So if I select a face on this body, I press show preview and change that thickness, just going to bring it down. The yellow preview shows me where it's going to remove material. Now it's going to remove material to whichever face that I've selected. So when I press OK, it removes that top face and the rest of it now has a 3mm wall thickness. You can shell multiple faces at once. So I can do these two faces as well, and it's going to remove that whole front area. You can also do the ends of something. So if it was like a hollow tube, you can have the tube as maybe a sweep or a loft, and then you can shell both ends. Now, if the entire object is to be hollow, when you press shell, instead of selecting a face, select this option here. This is for a solid body. Select the body, press preview, and then you can see it's going to hollow out the inside of the object without removing any of the faces. Okay. So with our object over here, I can also use the calipers to measure that thickness. So that comes in at about 1.5. So shell 1.5, select the face, press preview. Now if you ever, and we'll touch on this when we do the surfacing demo, if you ever do the shell and the preview doesn't come up, it's usually an indicator that there's going to be an issue with your the shell working or not. Sometimes it might show some problem areas but still work, which is okay. But if it doesn't work, you need to go back and edit your previous modeling. So it might be some surfaces that are not quite smooth enough that you need to smoothen out, okay, or some fillets or details that are too small. But for this object, that's worked fine. So I press OK, and what you'll find is on the inside of that shell, it's replicated what you see on the outside, okay, minus that 1.5mm. So because these fillets are only 1mm in size, by the time it offsets to the inside, there's nothing left. That's why on the inside, there's no smooth shape there, okay. So look at this object though, it's actually got some rounded corners around the outside of that brick. So all these corners on the model here, these edges, they're actually rounded. Okay, so I'm going to put the fillets in, and just to exaggerate, I'm going to bump them up to 2mm. And I'm also going to put a very small fillet, maybe 0.2 around each of these cylinders. All right, now if we look at our shell, we can see, you know, that hasn't affected anything. Those fillets, obviously after that shell feature. When you're modeling your objects, to try and work out whether a feature that is visible on the outside needs to be before the shell feature, what you do is have a look at the inside of your object, and if you can see that detail reflected on the inside, then you know it needs to be before the shell. So one of the details, which might be very hard for you guys to see at there, but is the small dimple in the center of each of these cylinders. On the inside of that object, I can see that dimple, right? So I need to put that detail before that shell feature. So how that looks and affects things, I can just show you by dragging this shell down below those fillets. You can see it's now included that radius when it's done this shell around this corner, and also this one here. So that detail on the top, now this is one of those more advanced tools we'll start to get into. What this is like a semicircle, like a reverse dome, a dome that goes down into the object. So again, I can measure the diameter of that. So it's about 3.5. And there's one in each of these. So this is sort of an example where if I just modeled a quadrant of this, I wouldn't have to do all this patterning and extra sketching. I'll just pattern the whole thing. But in this case, it doesn't take me too long to change things. What I'm going to do is a split line. So that splits that face into two. So that's under curves, split line. By splitting that face, I'm able to select that inside surface or that inside face for a dome instead of it being the whole top face. Now I'm going to change that size to be half and just to reverse the direction, and you can see that dome going down. Now I actually don't think it goes that deep. I'm just going to change that to 1. Now with the dome feature, you could do multiple domes at once, however they then lose their shape. You can see these go a bit, I don't know what the word for that, but they're no longer a perfect sort of semicircle. Right, so that's where I have to just do one dome at a time. So I have to repeat that feature. So to repeat, press enter, select dome, reverse direction, okay. All right, and now I roll back down of the shell, and then on the inside, you can see that that detail has been included in that feature. All right. Any questions on that method there?
I just missed the split part.
Yeah, sure. So when I've got this surface here, I want to put a little dome in the middle, okay, in that small section. I don't want it to be this whole face, but if I go insert features dome, it selects the entire face, right? So what I need to do is split that face into 2 sections so that I can just do a dome in that small section in the middle. So on that face, I do a sketch, and that sketch, now these sketches for split lines can be any shape. Once I've drawn the sketch, I go curves, split line, I select that face, press OK, and it's going to split it into 2 faces. Then I'm able to select that inner area and use that for something else. All right, cool. So I'm going to leave that there. So we will get into some surfacing stuff soon, but before we do that, what I'd like everyone to do is actually get out their object, and you may not have paper in front of you, which is fine, but just start to think about the way that you're going to model that object. And I'll come around just for 10 minutes, just speak to everyone, touch base to give you an idea about how to start it. So from the next demo onwards, you can actually start building your object. So, for the example, I'm going to use this mouse here. Okay, you can model reference on the mouse in front of you. It doesn't really make a difference. The main idea is to create an enclosed volume that's from surfaces converted to a solid that we can then shell and split and then start to add other detail to. All right, and this will show some of the basic surfacing features that we've got to work with. So I'm going to run, I'm not going to follow the tutorial step by step, but it'll be the same result in the end. Always start with the sketches setting up our shape. So our first aim with this object here is to create the top edge that's on the outside. Okay, so not the one that's on the bottom that's kind of flat, but the 3D curve that goes around that outside edge. All right. To get that curve, we need to create a few other sketches first. The first sketch I'm creating is one that's going to give me my overall sort of scale. So
Which plane are you on?
I'm on the top plane. So this first sketch is going to show my overall size of the mouse. So I've got some calipers, so I'm just going to measure this one as I go. This is not crucial for the demo, but if you're measuring your object, these are the sort of things you might want to be doing. Alright, so 98. And the sketch that I'm going to draw now is what I can see when I'm looking directly down at my mouse. Okay, so it's it's sort of the outside edge. Okay, it's not the edge that's on the bottom of the mouse, but it's the most extreme edge that I can see. So I've got 98 for that size. Now I'm going to use the spline tool. You could use arcs and lines, but I'm going to use the spline. The spline tool is like the pen tool in Illustrator. Alright, it'll have points which you can adjust. If you adjust it too far, it will sort of lose its shape. So you can click those arrows and drag and rotate. You can remove points by pressing delete, or you can add points by right-clicking on the line, going insert spline point, and adding a new point. So those points can be dragged, and they can also be dimensioned. So you can dimension between points. So this shape that I'm going to create is going to be pretty close to the shape that I can see in front of me. As close as possible. Okay. Now, one of the keys with this is that my spline does not pass over these horizontal lines here. Okay, so you can see that little section at the top and the bottom. If this was to remain as my edge, later on when I have my surfaces and I mirror them, they're going to come into a sharp point at the top and the bottom. All right. Instead, at those points, my spline needs to be tangent to that. Okay, so it's going to be a smooth join. So top and bottom, I need to make them tangent. I also want to make those two horizontal lines for construction. Now the other thing I'd probably like to do, and this is dependent on the design, but my line should not be dipping back down again below that. All right, and that will cause a big problem for your projected curve. All right, so if your projected curve doesn't work in a couple of steps time, come back to this first sketch and make sure that your spline does not dip below. It's got to be above. So I'm just going to adjust my shape, try and get it a bit closer to what I can see in front of me. Now, if this is my object that I'm going to be measuring, what I might like to do is either draw some lines on my object or put some masking tape on my object across a couple of points. I can then draw a line or somehow measure the distances at those different points. So at the widest here, I know that that is actually 30 millimeters out from that edge. So that tells me that I have to adjust all these other points, bring them right in. Now if I've got dimensions for all of them, that makes that really easy to do. Okay, but for your first sketch, if you're setting up your own object, you try and dimension as many of those as you can. I'm going to skip the rest of them there. And I'm just going to press OK on that sketch. So there's my first sketch. My second sketch, this sketch is what I can see on the bottom of the mouse. So this is the sketch that's flat, basically on the table surface. And it's a similar shape, but slightly different. To save time, I'm just going to offset the first one. Okay, so this is cheating. In reality, it's not exactly the same shape. It's slightly different, but I'm just going to offset that and press OK. So that's my second sketch. Now my third sketch is on the right plane. So this is now looking at the side of the mouse. And this isn't me looking at the mouse and saying, okay, this is the very top extremity. Instead, the line that I'm going to try and replicate here is the line that I can see coming around that outside edge. Okay, so it's not the top, it's the outside edge. Okay, that 3D curve. So this line, I think in the demo it might be done with a arc or an ellipse even. I'm going to do it with a spline again. So my right plane, do a spline. It doesn't start here, it starts above. And it's pretty straight. Actually comes up to a point and then it sort of comes back on itself a little bit like that. Again, you can add dimensions. So I can dimension the highest point, 30 millimeters. All right, I just have to adjust everything else once I've got that. Now, here's one of the keys. So remember, this first step is creating that projected curve. The start and end points of my spline need to match with the start and end points of my very first sketch. So they need to be vertical. So I select them both and make them vertical. Same at the end. So both ends should be vertical. And again, if you want to be accurate, you can add dimensions. So I'm just going to add some dimensions here. So if you were to dimension each point on that spline, it would be fully defined. I'm going to skip that, but that's what I would be expecting of you with your objects. All right, so I press OK. So I've got 3 sketches. So I'm going to create the projected curve. So under surfaces or features, you can see this curves button. Select that, select project curve, and we're going to do sketch on sketch, and basically it's going to combine 2 sketches together. So I select sketch 1 and sketch 3, and then you can see the yellow preview. So that preview is a basically combination of those 2 sketches, from that top view and from that side view. If when you're looking at your preview, it doesn't match up at the start and end point, it's most likely because one of those sketches does not match with the other one, okay? They're not vertical, or your sketch bends back on itself. So remember this first sketch we did here? If that line came up and then back down, the projected curve would stop at the point where it comes back down. Right, it can't come back on itself. Press OK. And you'll see that creates a basically 3D curve. So that's curve 1 in our feature tree. That curve 1 includes those 2 sketches. That curve is like a feature. So if you wanted to edit it, you can select that original sketch, change the dimensions, and it's going to affect your curve. Okay, so it's still editable. You can adjust the surfacing or these curves later on if you need to. All right, so the aim of this surface or this projected curve on the outside edge is to enable us to create the surface that goes around the side of my mouse. All right, so we're doing it in two steps. We do the side and then we do the top. So around the side, I can now do a loft. So I can select lofted surface. I can select sketch on the bottom and the one above, the curve above it, and I can see my lofted surface. Now this has to be, when you select a loft, it has to be the loft that's on the surfaces tab, not the solid bodies or the features tab. Okay, it must be under surfaces. Now, we can't see much of the shape here, but if I scroll down to curvature display, I press mesh preview, we can see a bit of a mesh and it can show me a bit of the shape of the loft. Okay, so that preview is okay. However, if I look at the mouse, that shape is actually a bit curved around the sides. It's not a straight line from top to bottom. All right, and the same I can see at the very front and rear edge, it's curved as well. So when I'm looking from this view, it's not straight, it should actually have a bit of a curve. So I'm just going to cancel that loft. What I need to do here is add some planes and some more sketches so that I can control that shape. So first step, on the right plane, we've already got a plane there. So when I want to create a sketch at this end, on the right plane I can do a sketch, and you can create this sort of profile in a number of ways. If it's a straight line, you can just draw a straight line. If it's an arc, you could do a 3-point arc. Okay, so this one at the rear is a bit like an arc, so I'm just going to use that tool. So I want to make sure that the top point of the arc pierces this curve. So I hold Control, select the curve, and press pierce. It's like coincident, but they're on different planes. Basically, the 3D curve is not on a plane, so instead I'm piercing the end of my 2D curve along the line of that 3D curve. The one at the bottom here, oh, didn't mean to do that. That should be coincident, okay, or again that could pierce, but if it's coincident that's fine. Now again, we want these to be dimensioned. So in this case, if I've got both ends locked down, I just need to add on a radius. So I'll put in a radius there, that's fully defined. So when you're doing your ends, those sketches need to be separate. All right, so just remember that. It's much easier when they're separate. So I'll do another curve at this end. Make that pierce. Make sure that one pierces as well. Give that a dimension. All right, two separate sketches. Now, this is where I've diverted a bit from the tutorial. So in the tutorial, this sketch one is the one that's on the inside, and it makes it a little bit easier to do this next step, but it doesn't really make too much of a difference. Basically, I want to create planes at each of these points. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show that sketch one. I'm going to reference geometry plane. I'm going to select that line and that point on the line. And that creates a plane that's on that angle. And on that plane, I can now do a 2D sketch to join between this line and this one here. All right, so even though I've used this line to create the plane, I'm still going to pierce this sketch and this curve. Now, instead of doing a 3-point curve, this time I'm going to use the spline. So I select spline, just going to draw a straight line and press escape. Select the top point, make it pierce. The bottom point, make it pierce. And then I can select the spline and I can grab these arrows and I can just drag them out to create the curve. So even though it looked like a straight line, because we used the spline tool, we can now adjust that shape using these. You can also add construction lines. Okay, so those two there can be for construction. And this one here is tangent to the spline. And so I can add a dimension between that if I want to be very specific about the angle of that spline at that top point. So you can control it that way as well. Right, so that's one. So what you would do is create a plane at each point where you're going to have a different shape. So you don't need to use every single point along the line, just the ones where the shape changes, the shape curves. Once you've created the planes, hide them, just so it's a bit easier to see. And then I'm just going to draw in these next two. So again, pierce and pierce. So all of these piercing relations, making sure things are matching up at both ends, these are all very important to make sure that your surface works. If you have issues creating your loft, using the guide curves, whatever it might be, go back and check your sketches to make sure that you've done them the right way and fully define them. Alright, so I'm going to hide that outside sketch again. Okay, so now what we've got are some profiles. So when we've got a shape like this, we can actually loft in either direction. So before I used this top curve to the bottom, but when I've got profiles around the side like this, it's better to do my loft around the outside. Now those control points, they go to the closest end that you click on. So if I click on the bottom, see it goes to the bottom. I just need to drag that point up to the top. Okay, so it knows the order. And if later on I need to add another profile to this shape, I just need to make sure the sketch is before the loft feature. I can then click on that sketch to include it, but what you might need to do is just reorder those sketches to get it back in the right position. Okay, so the loft goes in order of the selections you can see in this property feature here. So that shows the detail there. Guide curves, I select that box, and this is where I select that top and bottom edge. And that will adjust my loft to suit those. And now press OK. And that has created my external surface. So if I want to change that, any of these sketches I can edit. Okay, or this original curve I can edit, and that's going to affect that surface. All right, so that's that first main surface on the mouse. Now we have to do the top. So this time on the right plane, this next sketch will actually be the line that would go down the middle of the mouse. Okay, so if I cut it in half, what I would see, again, it's going to be a spline, but that really depends on what your actual shape is. And again, you could add dimensions if you wanted to. Now, one thing with this spline, again, I want to try and avoid having a sharp point like this. This really should be smooth coming up there. So where you can use sketch relations. So I can select this edge, hold control, select that spline, make it tangent. All right, that way it's going to be smooth at that point. adjust those a little bit. Maybe delete that one. And I should do the same here, make that tangent as well. Okay, and okay. Again, you could add dimensions. I'm going to skip that step. So this one's a bit different. We don't need to do any extra work between these two. Okay, unless there was a really particular shape that top had, right, we can pretty much just go straight into the next loft. So I go loft. Just before I do that, I'm going to hide this curve, okay, because I want this loft to join onto the surface edge, not the curve. So I select sketch and then edge. Now you can see that loft, it's going straight down. But like we learned with our pivot pin, we can control the start and end by using the constraints. So the start constraints in the middle, that's going to be normal to profile, which means in the middle here, it's at 9 degrees. So when we mirror it, it'll be smooth across the top. On the outside edge, that also should be tangent, okay, but maybe not that big, so I can just bring that down a little bit. Okay, so it's smooth, but it's not distorting the shape too much. Press OK. Okay, and there's the top half of my mouse. Alright, so next I'm going to mirror. So when you mirror, you can still use features mirror. Typically, when I'm mirroring surfaces, while sometimes you can do features or faces, I nearly always use bodies. So mirror it as a surface body. Press OK. Alright, and all that's left to do now is fill in the bottom area. So that's a planar surface. So on the surfaces command manager, you've got extrude, revolve, sweep, and loft, like we've used previously. Boundary and filled surface will fill in gaps in certain instances. Freeform converts any surface into a freeform one, which you can just pull and move around, but that's not parametric. All right, so you've got no control over dimensions there. Planar surface will let you fill in any flat surface. So if it's flat, you select the edges, it'll create a surface to fill it in. Offset will do what it says there, so it'll offset. You can also use offset to copy. So you can make it 0, it will copy a surface. Fillet. Fillet works once you've knitted surfaces together. Okay, so if you have a black line between the surfaces, you can add a fillet. Trim lets you cut holes in surfaces. Extend will move them out. So if I go extend surface and select this edge, I can extend that out. It's not always that reliable. All right, but that can be used in different situations. And then when we want to turn this from a surface to a solid, we use knit surface. So knit surface, you select each of the surface bodies. Once you've selected all of them and it creates an enclosed volume, you can hit this button here to create solid. Press OK, and that turns it into a solid body. So you can see now the lines are changed. This is changed to a solid bodies folder. And if I do a section view, you can see all the way through it. All right, so last steps now for the demo. So this is where we can then start thinking about the other details. So one of the first things I'd be doing is looking at shell, the body. So I'm not removing any face, so I just select show preview. Because there's only one solid body there, it's automatically going to select that body. Now, shelling is where you often encounter issues with your surfaces. So you can see I've pressed show preview there, nothing's happened. I'll press the tick. This is a little bit of a warning, which you can usually ignore, but it will sometimes lead you to consider any small radiuses. So any small radiuses might be around this tangent edge or at the front or very back corner. All right, just where those two lofts meet. We'll see what happens. Okay, so it's failed, but it gives me a bit of an idea why. Basically, at this point here, the curvature is too small, and same, not at the rear, but mostly at the front. So there's a couple of ways we can go about it. First, to just try and see what's going on, we can lower the thickness. So I'm going to take that down to 0.5. You can see that works no problem. Bump that up to 1. And that's fine as well. So this is one where if your object you're modeling it and the thickness you measure is 1.5, but you can get the shell to work at 1.2, that's probably fine. Okay, I'm not going to be concerned with that. But if you can only get the shell to work at 0.2 of a millimeter, and that's not going to allow you enough thickness to do other details, then that's a problem you'll have to go back and fix with the surfacing. To go back, so you can see that shell has worked. Okay, remove that material. If I was to go back and try and rectify that, you can just see here some of the, on screen, the lines are, it's a little bit weird what's happening there. There's also certain tools like you can turn on curvature. Okay, so curvature will highlight places where the surface is really being tightly pulled. So you can see that's happening around this edge, which we expected. It's also happening right on this point. So something I might want to do is go back to this loft here and adjust this sketch. So maybe I take that tangent off and I just try and adjust that so slightly to the inside, press OK. Have a look at curvature again. It's still pretty dark, but I'd be interested to see if the 1.5 shell would now work. So that's the other thing that you can try is adjust your surface, come back to the shell, adjust the thickness again, see if you can get it to work. So there's going to be a lot of trial and error with your models, with your surfaces, and whether you're surfacing or not, don't expect to model this project correctly the first time. Okay, you might get to a point, realize you need to go back a number of steps, make a lot of changes. That's very normal for this project. Okay, a lot of trial and error. Try different tools, work out what's working, what's not, and go from there. Just gonna, the very last step I want to show on this is the split. So we looked at split with the multi-body demo last week, how you could split into separate bodies into separate files. In this case, I just want to separate top and bottom and maybe a button. On the right plane, I'd create a sketch. So this sketch would be the line which would identify the two different parts. All right. So that might be this edge, or it might be another edge totally. So I can sketch that line, or I can, I could potentially convert an existing line like that. Now you just need to make sure that that sketch passes all the way through your object. So that's why I've just extended those edges. I can then go features or insert features, split, cut part. Now, if sometimes that doesn't work, just because the surface is too complex on that exact line for it to split properly. Just offset the line, maybe 0.1 of a millimeter down or up, and you should be able to separate it. The other thing to think about, this split means that there's no gap between those two parts. If there's actually a gap, then instead of a split, you could do a cut extrude. So you might have a cut extrude which is a 0.1 mil thickness between the two lines, and you cut all the way through. So these are the really sort of small details you think about, but the result in the end will be pretty similar. So we can see now we've got two solid bodies, and here I can do an exploded view in this part file just to show what they look like. So from this point onwards, I could start doing, you know, internal detail on the bottom. I could do the lip detail between the two parts and go from there and build from there. All right, so that'll be it for demos tonight. We're sort of flying through content. I will show, if there's anyone in particular that has any specific questions about surfacing or modelling or anything for their objects, I will show it on screen or make a note of it and show it next week. All right, but for, you know, the next hour, it's your time now to have a go, start at your models, and if you're stuck on anything, yell out and I'll come and help you out.